take
WebEx
roll call
Assistant is enabled to
to
save
ensure that we
audio
have quorum.
highlights.
And Tammy, if you could please take the roll call. I will bring this meeting to order.
Deb Barber. Deb Galswick.
Here.
Gracie George. Amy Jorgensen.
Present.
Andrea Rothler.
Present.
Susan Vento.
Present.
Gracie George.
Present.
Quinn Galswick.
Present.
Vice Chair Lee.
Present.
And by chance, Chair Johnson. Roll call complete.
All right, next up is the approval of the agenda. Everyone's should be able to see the agenda before them. Can we get a motion to approve the agenda?
Vento moves approval.
Is there a second?
Jorgensen, second.
Thank you, committee members. Next on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. The minutes from the November 17th, 2020 meeting should have been sent to y'all. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes? Or actually, wait, do you need a motion or is this just?
We can do roll call. Vice Chair Lee, I
Okay.
can begin that. Deb Barber. Deb Barber. Quinn Galswick.
Approved.
Gracie George.
Approve.
Amy Jorgensen.
Approve.
Andrea Rothler.
Approve.
Susan Vento.
Approved.
Vice Chair Lee.
Approved.
Deb Barber. Roll call complete.
Thanks, Tammy. Next up, our first business item is the State Auditor's Entrance Conference. And we have Stephanie Kuka and Aaron Tree. I hope I said your names correctly.
I'm here as well with the state auditors. My name is Amy Ames, and I just wanted to take a minute as we get started today to let you know about some changes we've had in our staffing at our office. I had been the audit director on Met Council for a number of years, but I'm happy to share that Stephanie Kuka has been promoted to audit director. And with that, she will be in charge of the Metropolitan Council audit. Aaron Try will be taking on a lead role here as well. Both Stephanie and Aaron have been working on the audit for many years, and the Met Council is in great hands with both of them. And with that, I will pass this off to Stephanie.
All right, thank you, Amy. Hopefully you can all see I'm sharing my screen. And we will get started. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a two-way means of communication for matters related to the financial audit that are significant and relevant to the responsibilities of those charged with governance in overseeing matters related to financial reporting and financial statement audit. The following information is fairly consistent with the prior few years, so we won't be going over all of it in detail, but we'll be highlighting some of the key items. As far as our staffing goes, staffing will remain fairly consistent with last year. Staff members have already begun initial audit planning, updating the system narratives, and performing some of the testing. Audit work will be based on the schedules of completion dates, which has already been provided by management. The Statement on Auditing Standards, AUC Section 260, the auditor's communication with those charged with governance. Auditing standards define those charged with governance and establish communication requirements between auditors and those charged with governance. At the Metropolitan Council, we have identified those charged with governance over the financial reporting process as the Metropolitan Council and the Audit Committee. The auditor's responsibilities under generally accepted auditing standards include forming and expressing opinions about whether the financial statements are presented fairly in conformity with accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America, and to report on the fairness of the supplementary information. We will issue 2 opinions, one on the financial statements and one on the Metropolitan Council's compliance with federal program requirements. Our audit will be performed in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, government auditing standards, the Single Audit Act of 1996, Uniform Guidance, and the Minnesota Legal Compliance Audit Guide for other public subdivisions. We will not express an opinion on the effectiveness of internal controls, as the audit is not designed to do so. We will communicate significant matters related to the audit that, in the auditor's judgment, are relevant to the responsibilities of those charged with governance. The following is the management's responsibilities, which have also been laid out in our engagement letter. To design, implement, and establish and maintain effective internal controls, identify all federal awards received and understand and comply with the compliance requirements, and for preparing the schedule of expenditures of federal awards in conformity with the uniform guidance. Number 4 here, making all management decisions and also designing a qualified management level individual to be responsible and accountable for overseeing our services. Mohammed Omar has had this responsibility since last year. Then we're going to skip ahead to the overview of the plan, scope, and timing of the audit. As I mentioned before, we are going to audit the basic financial statements of the Metropolitan Council. The Council will again be seeking the Government Finance Officers Association Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. This means that the Council needs to have the final comprehensive annual financial report submitted to the GFOA by June 30th of 2021. We also apply limited procedures to the financial data schedule to determine whether it is fairly stated in relation to the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2020. We will compare the electronic submission of items identified by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Real Estate Assessment Center with the corresponding documents. We will also apply certain agreed upon procedures to the data used for the federal funding allocation statistic forms, which are included in the National Transit Database reports for both the Metropolitan Council and Metro Transit. We have been instructed by the state auditor that the Office of the State Auditor staff should continue working from home until further notice, and most likely through June 30th of 2021. We therefore are planning to not be on site at the Metropolitan Council through most, if not all, of this audit year. However, exceptions may be made if the need to be on site does arise. Our preliminary audit plan has us completing field work by the end of May, but that is dependent on the schedule of completion. If all goes as planned, we will issue our opinion on the financial statements and our management and compliance report by June 30th in time for the Council to be in compliance with the GFOA's certificate program. Audit findings will be communicated to management as the audit progresses. We will also communicate any significant audit findings at the management exit. The engagement letter has been sent and we just received it earlier this week. The federal single audit for 2020, the Metropolitan Council meets all of the qualifications needed to be considered a low-risk auditee for single audit purposes. This means that we will only be required to test 20% versus 40% of the Council's total federal dollars spent in 2020. All Type A programs are required to be tested at least once every 3 years. Due to CARES Act funding, we will be testing the following federal program for the 2020 audit, the Transit Cluster. We anticipate that this program will be more than adequate to meet the 20% testing threshold. Our analysis was based on preliminary information, and additional programs may need to be tested if they are identified later on in the audit. This next section is a status of prior year findings that were included in our management report. The first one, 2019-001, is access to computer systems. During our review of access to the Metropolitan Council's computer systems, 3 of the 25 employees tested who had left employment did not have their network access revoked until 14 days or more after the individual's departure. Additionally, there were 4 instances where the manager did not submit a termination request to notify information technology of an individual's end of employment. This finding was not considered a material weakness. We recommend that the Metropolitan Council implement additional procedures to ensure the removal of a terminated employee's network access in a timely manner. We will perform additional follow-up procedures on the computer system access during our current audit. And I know we already are aware that there are new policies, procedures in place that require managers to fill out a termination report. The next finding is on contract compliance, 2019-002. In 2 of the contracts tested, there was language missing regarding the requirement for payment of interest by the contractor to the subcontractor if not paid on time. We recommend that the Metropolitan Council be compliant with all the contract language requirements in Minnesota statute. We will follow up during the current audit to determine if this condition still exists. This next section, which is rather lengthy, is the new accounting and auditing pronouncements. This includes not only the accounting and auditing pronouncements for this year, but for the next few years. It's listed here for your information. Management is aware of them and have already taken steps to implement them. So I will scroll to the next section. The last section, other items. Auditing standards require us to meet and communicate certain items to those charged with governance. Would you like us to meet with the full Metropolitan Council to go over what we discussed here today? If not, then the notes on this meeting will be distributed to the Metropolitan Council. Is distributing the notes to the Metropolitan Council, is that sufficient? I can't see anyone.
So, Matt, is this a question we put up to a vote within our body here at
No,
this time?
Vice Chair Lee, this is something you can respond to directly, and just for your information, typically we have not elected to go to the full council in past years. And just and the notes are distributed to the council.
Okay. Well, Stephanie, I think we'll keep a tradition and distribute the notes to the council.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. The following section are for some fraud questions that I have. And so I don't know the best way for us to address them here, but I'll ask the questions and feel free to pop in. What are the Audit Committee's views on the risk of fraud?
I think well, we have a responsibility to the public to make sure that there is no fraud, and that this is why we have processes and policies in place to ensure that there isn't, and if there is, then we take the appropriate legal measures to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, perfect. Do you have any knowledge of any actual, suspected, or alleged fraud affecting the Metropolitan Council or its federal award programs?
No, I do not.
Do you have any knowledge of any possible or actual non-compliance or abuses of programs and controls during the audit period or the subsequent period?
No, I do not.
And then what is the Audit Committee's role in the oversight of management's process for identifying and responding to fraud risks?
We we have a lot of policies in place to ensure that employees can report alleged abuse and fraud.
Okay.
And we also have policies to ensure that if those things do occur, that we do our best to extinguish and prevent them from happening.
Okay. Perfect. Is the Metropolitan Council in compliance with laws, regulations, contracts, and grant agreements as far as you are aware?
Yes, we are.
And then is there anything else you'd like to add or anyone else you think that we should be talking to about fraud?
I don't think so. I can't think of anyone at this time.
Okay. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns?
I don't have any, but unless if any other committee members have any questions for Stephanie.
Vice Chair Lee?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a little bit about the additional testing you're planning on doing related to the CARES Act. I'm wondering if that is specific to funding that was received by the Met Council from the CARES Act, or if it's just additional requirements that are being required that were embedded in that act for other audit work you would normally be doing anyway.
So the Metropolitan Council's CARES funding actually came through a federal program that they already had. And so there are some additional requirements for our testing, but it very much follows just the grant program in general that was already at Metropolitan Council. So it's a little bit different than, I know there's also the CARES Act where there's a specific CFDA number and there's a lot of specific requirements for that. This was a little different. The money came directly from the federal government.
Okay, follow-up question?
Yep.
So is there any additional testing steps or things that you have to do specific to the CARES Act, or is it more of just you sampled things that were related to it?
Yes, it's following the general non-CARES funding. It's all in the same bucket. So yep,
Right.
It's the sampling, the same sort of thing. There might be extra reports or that sort of thing, but we've just started our work on it. So I can provide you really specific information.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions from committee members? All right, thank you for that update, Stephanie and Amy.
Yep, thank you very much.
Our next business item is the risk assessment and audit plan amendment, and Director Latour will be giving that presentation.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lee, and thank you for stepping in and chairing this meeting today. Appreciate that, and thank you to our state auditors for the presentation. Committee members, just a quick update to our audit plan. As you recall, you approved our audit plan at our last meeting in November, and I think even at the time I teased up that we had a few projects that were just sort of bubbling at the time, and I'm bringing a few amendments to this plan today to bring to your attention to add to the audit plan going forward. So there are three that are bolded here on the list, if you can see the list. The first is a communications consultation, and this is really led by our communications department. Terry Dressen, the director, is looking at a number of reviews of our own department. She's been in that position for about a year, and she's asked us really just for, I'd say, just assistance with a few of these projects. One specific is an audit of communications that goes out, regular communications that go out to all council employees. And so really we're just helping here. I think it's a collaborative effort to leverage our resources in terms of surveying and knowledge of audit processes to help with what is ultimately her project. So I just wanted to add it to the list because we will devote some resources to it, but I don't expect it'll be a hugely labor intensive project for us. But so adding that, the second is Metro Transit safety audit. This would be a full audit. This is based really a couple different things. There's been a number of activity, particularly related rail, but in other departments at Metro Transit, that have been brought to our attention in terms of safety complaints that we've been working through. We've also just had a state safety oversight audit last fall that had a number of recommendations and follow-up. And then thirdly, there's a new federal requirement from the FTA about safety that will be tested in our triennial audit that'll take place beginning the end of this year, submitting paperwork, and then the on-site audit will take place in 2022. So a combination of things made us think that it would be a good time for us to look at the processes by which complaints, all sorts of things related to safety, related to federal compliance, how complaints are related to safety are processed and resolved. So more to come in terms of the specificity around this audit, but we've already done some work in this area just to try to do some preliminary risk assessing and think this would be a worthwhile audit. And the final thing is a police benchmarking consultation. This again is something we've been asked to just provide some basic information. As many of you are probably aware, the Citizens League is conducting a review community engagement project related to the PD. This is, kind of a side project just to look at what some of our peer agencies, both in the region and also other transit police agencies do in terms of reporting information publicly, and then thinking about how they handle some other issues like fare compliance and arrangements with other police departments in their regions. So again, this will just be providing information. It's not an audit, not anything that will come up with conclusions or recommendations necessarily, but just some support we're offering to Metro Transit Management. So those are the three additions, and I just ask that you approve the updated plan. Just a note, I didn't take anything off of here, so we probably have a little bit more capacity than the 75% would indicate. However, I think that as we go through the year and probably in mid-year, June, or potentially even the fall, we're going to revisit some of these issues. I know there's a few that I've already had some communications with some senior managers about, whether the timing is still right for an audit. So we may take some things off and adjust this plan as we continue to work through the year. I think it's just, as I've said many times in the last year or two, really think of this as a living document more than just a fixed plan for a full year. So with that, I'd ask for your approval of the 2021 audit plan. Unless there are any questions, happy to take those as well.
Thanks, Matt. Are there any questions from committee members? All right, if there are no questions, then Tammy, if you could please take a roll call.
We'll need a council member to make a motion and then a second, and I'll take roll call.
Sorry, yes, I forgot.
No problem.
Moved by Barber.
Second by Galswick.
Thank you. Okay. Now we can take a roll call. Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lee. Deb Barber,
Aye, and I just want to note I was here for the roll call and approve the minutes, or a vote aye and approval of the minutes as well. But now that I have my audio working.
thank you, Councilmember Barber. Quinn Galswick,
Approved.
Gracie George,
Approved.
Amy Jorgensen,
Approved.
Approved. Susan Vento,
Sue, you're muted.
Sorry, approved.
Vice Chair Lee,
Approved.
Susan Vento,
Approved.
Susan Vento,
Approved.
roll call complete.
Thanks, Tammy. Next up, we have a few information items. The first information item is the director's report. And go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lee and members of the committee. So it feels like after a year, we still, there's always going to be some audio issues to resolve, but we're getting through it, right? For the director's report, I guess the first thing on the agenda would be to officially announce Julia Quell as audit manager. I think the last time we met, we were just finalizing this process, but I'm happy to announce that she's taken the position and has been operating for about 2 months very successfully. And I included an update of our organizational chart here to reflect the change in the department. Following this hire, we'll have 2 open positions to fill in the next few weeks to months. One that we actually have open, well, we just closed it. We'll focus primarily, we recruited really primarily around IT issues to help support Kevin Ely, who's been working as our IT auditor for a number of months. I think we feel like we have enough on our plate related to IT and that there's just enough that this person with IT skills could help with on a lot of our other audit work that we've decided to focus one position on IT. So we're looking forward to reviewing some resumes and hoping to find a good candidate to fill that position. And the second position will look more in the late spring, early summer to fill more of a generalist position to work with Julia and team on a range of projects. We also are planning on hiring 2 intern positions to start this summer. That's down. We've typically hired 3. But we've had a bit of a shift in priorities. We're doing a little bit less of the subrecipient monitoring work. We'll still continue to do some of that as needed, but a little bit less. So we're going to reflect that change. We'll be going from 3 positions to 2 positions over the summer. So we again look forward to bringing on additional interns that have been to support what's been a very successful internship program for us. As the council members probably know, maybe the community members don't all know, Meredith Fadis officially resigned as regional administrator last month. She had been working with the state on the state's COVID testing program for most of the pandemic, since probably about last April or so. So I've been reporting to Mary Bogie as the acting regional administrator since that time, and we'll continue that relationship at least until there's an appointment of a permanent regional administrator. Just a side note, normally by this time of year, the audit committee would have been made aware of, as audit director, my performance evaluation. We're a little bit behind on that process this year, just in part because of because of really the situation where we've had a lot of people in acting positions and Mary's been working a number of different positions. So we're still working on finalizing some things. So expect to see some more information about that in the coming weeks and months. Just a kind of an update, which is kind of a non-update on COVID. We still continue to work remotely, and we'll do so through at least June of 2021. I anticipate that date will be probably even pushed through the summer at some point in the next few weeks, but I know that's a decision that we're looking at closely right now. I think in general, I'd say we've continued to be fairly successful working from home, though I think, it'll certainly be a benefit for our team, conducting audit work when we can at least have some in-person interaction with each other and our auditees. So we'll be looking forward to trying to work back some on-site work as the pandemic starts to move into a different phase. I always hesitate to say ends because who knows when that'll be, but hopefully there'll be brighter days ahead through the summer and the fall. A note for our committee, I expect that given our schedule, our next meeting at least will continue to be virtual, and we'll continue to evaluate whether these meetings would be virtual or in person or a combination of both going forward. Related to the pandemic, as I've mentioned before, I continue to serve as the planning chief for 390 Robert Street. Been spending a lot of time working on our vaccine rollout. As you may be aware, our public transit workforce and our wastewater workforce are included in phases 1B and 1C of the CDC's pandemic vaccine rollout. And we continue to engage with state and do some planning as much as we can for getting our workforce vaccinated when vaccines become available. In addition, I've been working on the plan for 390 Robert to eventually be brought back to work. So I'd say the biggest challenge of this has just been time. It takes a lot of time to have a lot of meetings and discuss all these issues. So as probably as much as anybody, I'll be looking forward to the pandemic ending so I can go back to just focusing entirely on my day job. Moving on to significant external audits. Just following our last committee meeting in December, the FTA FHWA had a joint team in doing, an on-site, all virtual, of course, meeting in December related to our Metropolitan planning organizations, practices, procedures. It's a regular cyclical 4-year review that we do on a regular basis. And we expect to see a report in the spring, but early indications were that that our organization passed with flying colors. But we'll wait eagerly for the final report to see if there's improvements that can be made. Just a note on the audit plan. We continue to work on a number of fronts. Southwest Light Rail. We started work on MnDOT funding agreements, workers' comp, electric bus procurement. Metro Transit Facility Security, as I mentioned before, the police benchmarking consultation, and we're nearly complete with a technology asset inventory audit that I expect to be able to report on fairly soon. Other activities, we are continuing to engage on ethics and compliance. As you were made aware, we rolled out our ethics point reporting tool last fall, which allows for employee reporting of fraud, waste, and abuse and other complaints related to employment. It's been a fairly successful rollout. A number of complaints have come through, so at least we feel like we're seeing complaints coming, so we think that it's been communicated, and we're seeing that tool being used. We're still working out workflow and thinking about some metrics that we can produce out of that system. Those are some of the agenda items for this year. And in addition, we're kind of taking more of a holistic approach to build off of what we've already done, thinking about ethics and compliance, and looking at our existing investigative practices to see if there's ways we can improve upon what we already do. Looking at updates and policies and procedures related to ethics, compliance, employee complaints, etc. And thinking about a new employee trainings related to fraud and other topics. I certainly, on my agenda for this year is to develop a fraud awareness training for all employees that we do, if not annual, at least on a regular cadence for new and existing employees. Continue to work with our new audit database. I think we've been able to migrate a lot of most of our information on our current audit work and our past audit work into the system. We're working with IS right now on the reporting component of this as well, developing regular reports on follow-up and the results of our audit work. I'm hoping that by June, depending on a few other things, but at least sometime this year, that I'll bring to this committee the results of that. So we'll be able to look at a regular, every meeting, where we are with follow-up on audit findings and closure, so you can have a better optic of not only our audit work as it comes through, but also the results after our follow-up is complete. And then, as always, we're continuing continuous improvement on audit manual and templates and work instructions as time permits, and we'll continue to work on improving our framework. So with that, I will take any questions you might have for me.
Thanks, Matt. Are there questions from committee members?
Mr. Lee?
Go ahead, Quinn.
Thank you. A couple of questions on this. So, and I apologize, Matt, if you told me this before, but as it relates to the audit database and the follow-up activities that you're doing, I'm really excited to hear that you're kind of thinking we're going to be able to get regular reports on that. I think that's really important to be able to confirm that items are being addressed the way that that was stated by management. Were you doing this informally before? Were you tracking it internally, and now this is just formalizing that so that you're able to report out? Or is this a new process that's being established to actually do this follow-up? Is my first question.
Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, yes, we've always done follow-up on our audits. I would say that in the years that I've been here, we've probably been less consistent with tracking everything and in a systematic way, if you will. It's been sort of left to each individual team member to make sure they're following up on their audit work. I think that what I'm hoping the tool will do is give that quick glance to me and to like having Tammy help track, when audit findings are due for a resolution, so we can be a little bit more systematic in terms of how we approach follow-up and also how we report on the results. So that's really the change here, is about just consistency and more of a systematic approach rather than what I would say has been an ad hoc approach to follow-up.
Okay. And then my second question, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as it relates to recruiting, so you said that there's 2 positions. Are you actively trying to fill those right now? Are those posted and you're interviewing, or is that something that you're looking to do in the next few months?
We have one that just closed. So we've the IT position we posted. It's closed now, and we'll be reviewing applications to see if we have sufficient quality within that group to move forward. The other position we plan to post probably like late spring, early summer.
Okay, thank you. Those are my 2 questions.
Chair Lee, this is Amy Jorgensen. I have a question also.
Go ahead, Amy.
Hi, just curious regarding the prior audit finding follow-up, how far back do you intend to look at audits to see if there are still outstanding issues? Do you have a set amount of time that you're going back? Can you explain that a little bit more, please?
Committee Member Jorgensen, yes, when we set up the database, our last SAIV, our last review, was about 2 years ago. So the idea is to go back as far as that point. So we'd have a full, when we get to the next one, we want to have that full 5-year look. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't go back even further if there's something that stood out to us, but at least for me, what I would like to do is make sure that we have everything from the end date of that, which was about 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions from committee members? All right, Director Lectora, thanks for that update and presentation, and thanks, congratulations to Julia. And speaking of Julia, she has the next item, which is our payroll audit. Go ahead, Julia.
Hi, let me share my screen here. Let's see. Okay, I had technical difficulties last time, so can everyone see the presentation and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Vice Chair Lee and members of the Audit Committee. I am here to present the findings of our payroll audit. Maxine Scott from Payroll and Mohammed Omar, the Council's Controller, are here and can help answer any questions at the end of the presentation. At the Council, employees submit their time via 104 system, and then the payroll team then interface the payroll systems with PeopleSoft HRMS and then distribute pay. The objective of our audit was to review and assess the internal control environment and the monitoring and administration of the payroll process. Our audit covered payroll policies and procedures, documentation and data from December 18th, 2018 to April 30th, 2020. We conducted interviews, reviewed payroll data, documentation, and controls. As part of our review of payroll processing, we reviewed for documentation for payroll corrections. There were 5,651 payroll corrections for the period January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2019, of which 4,319 were for time taken due to DOT physicals or compiling accident reports. Corrections may also be needed for an employee who forgets to mark 8 hours of vacation in a prior period, as an example. We requested supporting documentation for 40 corrections. Documentation was unavailable for 15 corrections, including 3 non-DOT physicals and accident-related corrections, and 12 DOT and accident-related corrections. The retention schedule for payroll earnings and deduction authorizations, corrections, and reclassifications is the current year plus 3 fiscal years. According to payroll staff, the corrections made for, payroll has been following a different retention period for both types of corrections, those due to DOT physicals and accidents, and those not made for DOT physicals or accidents. According to payroll staff, the corrections made for DOT physicals and accident reports are corrections that must be made due to system limitations rather than a correction for something like forgetting to mark vacation. And so payroll doesn't follow the retention schedule for these types of corrections. Our recommendation was that payroll should follow the retention schedule for corrections or consider updating the schedule and define what is considered a correction versus a system limitation formally in a procedure. And so management acknowledges payroll needs to follow the council's document retention schedule for payroll corrections, and also management needs to define what is considered system limitation corrections versus routine or normal corrections. Management plans to hold a training session with payroll staff to ensure they are following the document retention schedule for payroll corrections, regardless of the type of correction. So we also requested work instructions and evidence of payroll control activities being completed in the past period. We requested those from payroll, and work instructions were requested for tasks identified in the narrative report, which is a document provided to the state auditors, as well as tasks identified during interviews with the auditee. Several tasks did not have written procedures, though there were some informal checklists. And there were also several tasks where documentation was not retained and there was inconsistencies with what is retained. So as a result, we couldn't confirm that the self-identified tasks are completed on a regular basis, and there are no requirements for having work instructions or retaining documentation. So our recommendation was that procedures should be created for payroll control processes, and management acknowledges the need for written payroll procedures that reflect controls. And our other recommendation was that payroll should document when they complete tasks and update the payroll narrative to reflect the tasks they complete and remove tasks they no longer complete. And so management acknowledges the payroll process documentation needs to be updated to reflect current processes. And so with that, I'll take questions.
Thanks, Julia. Other questions from committee members? If I can't see your hand raised, just go ahead and speak up. Julia, I have one question. My question is what is the timeline for closing the loop on following up with management about the last point?
About the last point, for the documenting the work instructions?
Yeah.
Yeah, so June 30th, 2021.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah,
so the scope was from December 18, 2018 to April 30th, 2020, and it looks like you selected 2 pay periods. How are those periods selected?
Well, let's see. For I'm sorry, what particular, are you talking about for the timesheet processing? I'm not sure who asked the question. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, for the sample selected, yeah. It looks like the scope of the audit was looking at, what was looking from December 18th, 2018 to April 30th, 2020.
Yeah.
And when the samples were selected, you picked from 2 payroll periods. How was that selection made?
Yeah, so for the timesheet processing sample, the first one, which was the payroll period ending 2019, and then for a period ending April 3rd, we selected those 2 periods because they fell over a holiday. So one was a holiday over Thanksgiving, and then the other one must have been, I'm not sure what the other holiday was, but yeah, there wasn't.
Are there any other questions from committee members? Seeing none, thanks, Julia, for your presentation, and we'll go on to our Next agenda item for information, it is the Regional Parks Audit. We have Kevin Ely, Tim Larson, and Sam Stork Post, and Brenna Bangfield.
Vice Chair Lee, members of the committee. My name is Sam Storkpost. I'm an intern in the Program Evaluation Audit Department.
And I'm Brenna Barchfield, also an intern in the same department.
So we're going to walk through the Parks audit. So for some background, Community Development Parks supports 10 parks implementing agencies via 5 different parks funding programs with distinct funding streams. And the objective of this audit was to evaluate the key controls for regional parks funding to confirm compliance with state statute. I'll note also that part of the impetus for doing this comes from the 2016 OLA audit of the Parks Department. So that audit did inform parts of our scope and methodology. The scope, we looked at the period of review was the most recent 2-year cycle for bonding for parks and parks planning. So 2018 planning and 2019 for funding. I want to note that there has not been a bonding cycle since then. And also there has been some staff turnover within the Parks Department since then. For methodology, we conducted substantial interviews with park staff and performed desk review on 15 grants that were awarded in that time period. Those 15 were chosen to cover the 5 different funding programs. So we will walk through some of what we found.
The first issue that we noted relates to the subrecipient administrative guide, which was intended to guide implementing agencies who park grants send money to in complying with statutory requirements. It was expected to be complete by the end of 2019, but at the time of the audit still had not quite gotten to that final draft stage. And the CD agrees with our recommendation that they should continue work to get it complete and get that sent out.
Next, looking at risk assessment, Parks is required to perform a risk assessment of those 10 implementing agencies. And there was evidence that was performed during the scope of our audit. However, the issue is that there are no formally documented or developed procedures or guides for linking risk assessments to further monitoring of grant recipients. Our recommendation is that CD Parks and CD Finance and administration staff should document how risk assessment will link in the future to oversight and monitoring processes. And I will note that Park staff has communicated to us that they've already made some improvements in this area.
Similarly, with appraisal reviews, this challenge comes related to the documentation of processes that they were doing. PAOF is one of the grant programs that we looked at, and which stands for Parks Acquisition Opportunity Fund. Because this relates to purchasing of land, there are appraisal reviews that need to be done. And in the 5 grants that we sampled, there were fields missing, such as appraiser name. And similarly, CD Parks should create a procedure, guide, or some sort of centralized documentation to clarify how the reviews are performed to ensure that that documentation is maintained. There is also an eminent domain challenge that we noticed in this appraisal review, and there's a new procedure being developed to handle that issue as well.
There's an issue with some grant agreement language. For 5 of the 15 grants sampled, there wasn't sufficiently detailed information in the grant agreement to match statutory requirements. In particular, the templates lack some guidance on land restoration and management plans, and also some of the specifics as far as eligible costs for reimbursement. Our recommendations are just that staff should develop procedures or guides to make sure that those 2 items, the land restoration management plan and sufficiently detailed explanations of eligible costs, be included in future templates. And Parks Management has indicated they will do so.
With financial tracking, there is not sufficient documentation to show that the 3-to-2 bond match, which refers to state and regional bonds, is adequately budgeted, tracked, and spent within a specified time frame, and that documentation is maintained. This is a case where we have adequate information on the budget, but what we're really hoping to see is linking that budget to spending, and so the recommendation is to create a procedure or guide to ensure those activities take place, and that documentation is maintained so that we can follow that line throughout.
There's an issue around documentation of grant applications. A little background here, Web Grants is the name of the program that Parks uses to manage grants, grant applications, and administering grants online. And in the past, Web Grants has also been used as a sort of de facto checklist for making sure that certain components are received. So looking at the grants in our sample, some of the applications lacked documentation within Web Grants that key requirements had been met in that application. Things like consistent council-approved master plan or certain criteria for bond-funded projects. So the recommendation is that Parks should develop procedures or guides to document both what grant application information is required and how that documentation will be maintained. And Park staff have agreed to do so.
And then finally, the equity grant program is the newest of the 5 programs we looked at, which is why we are only able to look at one of the grants from it. The purpose of looking into the equity grant pilot was largely to see how information was gathered and lessons learned to move forward with it. And there was one documentation issue we noted where in the original iteration of the equity grant program, it was intended to focus on capital costs. However, the budgets that we saw in the program we looked at didn't delineate clearly between capital and non-capital costs. Moving forward, future iterations of the equity grant program are allowing for non-capital costs such as programming and staff funding.
With that, we'll be happy to address any questions. And actually for questions, we will turn it over to Auditor in Charge, Kevin Ewing.
Thank you. Are there questions from committee members?
Vice Chair Lee, this is Andra Rothler. Hi, just a recommendation maybe for Matt's consideration. It's difficult as someone who's not intimately familiar with Met Council's operation to be able to necessarily infer what I think of as the effect or the risk that's being identified here. So when you're presenting your findings, it might be helpful to include that in the summary. It's difficult, for example, for me to tell based on what you just reported. For example, are some of your recommendations perhaps just addressing some relatively important but not critical administrative kind of details? Or are some of the things that you're running across potentially in violation of the grant rules that could potentially reduce the amount of funding that you're getting or how you're distributing the funds? So some discussion of that in addition to just what the findings were would be really helpful to me. And if that made sense, I hope that made sense.
No, Vice Chair, members of the committee, it's a really good point, and it is something we actually talked a lot about in the development of this report. I would say that it is, if we had found in particular compliance issues, we would have said that. And so I think probably just without being specific in general, this is a lot of potential risk of not being clear about spending, not being able to track funds, but not to a point where we found examples of non-compliance, if that makes some sense. So it's something we'll try to be clear about in the future. I know it's something that we talked and discussed with the finance folks quite a bit in the development of the report. We probably could have made that a little bit clearer. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Are there any other questions or comments from committee members?
Vice Chair Lee, this is
Yep.
Representative Ellsworth. So just a question on the 3-2 match. I was on that issue. I was trying to understand that a little bit and kind of, to Andre's point, trying to understand what the real risk was here. So were we, or is Met Council out of compliance in this situation with this requirement, or is it that Met Council's in compliance with the 3-2 match? It's just that we don't have proper tracking in place to be able to demonstrate that. And could you maybe just provide a little bit of background explanation on that 3-2 match, what it is, and yeah, whether we're in compliance with it?
Sure, Vice Chair Lee and members of the committee, and turn my video back on. We spent quite a bit of time on this one in particular, and we worked through the council's bond council to discuss exactly what the potential risks were here, and it is sort of the former of the two that you cited, that it's not as much of a necessarily compliance problem, but the tracking, and there's been some changes made in the last few years to begin to better track and link appropriation bonds by appropriation year to expenditures, but changes that have just been made recently. And so, and we're really asking for is just better documentation to make sure that we're tracking through and can follow. So hopefully that answers your question. I know that there's a few people too from CD Finance and others that might, if they would like to try to address your question, they certainly could too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. If there's any other folks who want to chime in or have any last questions. All right, thank you. And thank you to the wonderful work and presentation of the interns. I have a special affinity for interns because I used to run the internship program for Mayor Chris Coleman in St. Paul. And so I hope you're finding that you're doing great meaningful work with us and for us, and thanks for your service. And with that, our next and last item is our next scheduled audit committee meeting. And Matt and Tammy, correct me if I'm wrong, but Tammy will send an email out with some possible dates, and then we all can kind of try to work that out through email, right?
Yes, Vice Chair Lee, we'll communicate in the next few weeks about the last meeting. Part of it depends on the state audit schedule. You know, as we had the entrance conference today, likely our next meeting will have the exit conference. And so it's a bit dependent on that schedule. So we'll reach out and work with the state auditor as well to come up with some potential dates for our next meeting. I just want to also, I neglected to note that there's a couple things just related to the committee. I had asked a few months ago about getting a few volunteers to stagger terms, to be reappointed, if you will, to make sure that we're not all the community members are not all in the same 4-year cycle, but that there's 2 that are staggered. So we'll probably be addressing that at our next meeting. And I did have a couple volunteers, so I'll just probably be reaching out to clarify and make sure that's all still the way we want to go. And I also just to put in your minds, you know, thank you for your service in this committee. And you know, when you've now been with us for nearly 2 years, and we've been tweaking our committee, how we handle our committees. We've talked a little bit about doing more with follow-up. I'd be interested to hear what the committee members would like to see more of, less of, in terms of how we approach our meetings. So I'll probably be reaching out in the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure if it'll be a survey or just, you know, an email, but to solicit some feedback for how we do these meetings and to see if there's ways we can improve or additional information that would be useful to the committee, just in terms of background. I know we kind of come at a lot of these topics with just 10 minutes of presentation, and it's sometimes out of context. So if there's specific things that we can provide a little more background on, training on for the committee, please let me know that as well. So just anticipate those questions coming in the next few weeks, along with the appointment for our next meeting.
Okay, thanks, Matt. That brings us to the end of our agenda. I want to thank everyone for your patience in tolerating me hold my first gavel in the Met Council body. I even did my hair and got it cut over the weekend, put gel on. So thanks for your grace and patience. And with that, I now adjourn our meeting. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.